Now, folks, on that theme of wealth, should we stop reporting on the gender pay gap? The latest figures suggest that women earn 90p for every pound that men do. Well, here to discuss this, I'm joined by political commentator Emily Carver and Susan Smith, who's the co-director of For Women Scotland. Susan, can I start with you, please? Should we actually end the reporting on the gender pay gap here? Aren't we just creating bureaucratic burdens for already struggling businesses?
No, I think the data needs to be collected. The issue is whether or not it's robust. So monitoring pay gap is very important for monitoring whether or not women are disadvantaged, whether there is sexism within companies, or indeed whether people are being paid equivalent amounts for an equivalent job. Glasgow Council came unstuck on this over the past few years because they were paying equivalent jobs which were deemed women's jobs significantly less than jobs that were deemed to be men's jobs, and where there were traditionally higher numbers of men and women employed in those two different areas. The issue is whether we are causing problems with how we're collecting the data. And at the moment in Scotland, people are not collecting data on sex, they're collecting data on other things. So there is an issue with how that data can be processed. And then there's an issue of whether that's going to lead to any actual structural change, because in order for this to be a worthwhile exercise, you have to be able to then analyse it and determine whether there are social issues or whether this is something that companies can do more to encourage more women back into the workforce in later life and potentially benefit from a wealth of experience.
Emily, you've heard what Susan's had to say there. Now, I'm not a biologist, but I do assume that you're a woman. Surely you would benefit, Emily, from this gender pay gap report and actually making the workplace a more equal place for a woman to be.
I think the problem is that the data doesn't show whether women and men are being paid the same for the same role, nor can it be used to decipher whether discrimination is at play. And that's because this government-mandated reporting doesn't show whether a firm is paying men and women different amounts for the same role. It compares the difference in women and men's average earnings across an entire organization at one point in time, regardless of their role. So it doesn't compare like with like. It does give you a slight idea of the relative distribution of pay levels between men and women, but you're not comparing the same role at the same role, the same level of experience, all these different aspects of someone's employment. It's just taking sort of meaningless averages and then trying to insinuate, therefore, that there must be discrimination at play. And that's the problem. We see the media and often feminist organizations representing this data in a misleading way. It's used often to suggest that women are getting paid less than men for the same job, which is illegal, and that's not what the data actually shows us. And we see campaign groups like the Fawcett Society use the data in really quite silly ways to claim that at one point in the year, women effectively stop getting paid as compared to their male counterparts. And it seems to me that this data isn't particularly enlightening. It's more just used as a lobbying tool for activists.
So, Susan, you've heard what Emily's had to say there. Are you concerned that these measures are actually convincing a new generation of women in the workplace that actually the cards are stacked against them, that they basically needn't bother because there's a certain point in the year at which they're working for free compared to men?
Look, I think a lot of what Emily said is absolutely true. That this is, as she said, a bit of a blunt tool. I don't think that means you throw the whole thing out. I think it means you try to make it better. And we have a lot of issues with data collection, as I've said. But if you get rid of it entirely, you remove any, let's be honest, there are companies out there who are not really going to care too much whether they have sex discrimination measures in place. And if you get rid of this entirely, you are going to make it harder to hold people to account going forward. So I think, yes, it is true. It's not comparing like to like, and there are distinct issues with how this has been interpreted. But that's an argument in my mind for making it better rather than getting rid of it in totality.
So, Emily, is it your view that this is just used by an activist class to perpetuate victim narratives around women?
I think it can be, certainly. I do see that from some feminist groups where they try to name and shame companies for having large gender pay gaps. And it can be quite unfair for some businesses. You know, the classic example is EasyJet. They've got an absolutely massive gender pay gap, and that's been named and shamed in the press previously. But that gender pay gap is down to the fact that more men are pilots, which of course takes more experience and skill than being cabin crew, which is dominated by females. And so that's why we get that appearance of a gender pay gap. And, you know, my concern is not just that this is a big regulatory burden for these businesses, but also what do we want? How do we want companies to fix this? You know, what I've heard from people in business is that there's a sort of move to almost manipulate these statistics because they have to, you know, appear to have a smaller pay gap. So what do? Well, you can parachute women into higher paid roles in an organization rather than based on merit. They may not necessarily be suitable for those roles, but it would improve their gender pay gaps. Or they could even decide to, you know, discriminate against men for higher paid roles. You could have arbitrary targets. But, you know, businesses' priorities isn't about social engineering. You know, their priority number one has to be to get the best person for the job, because their priority at the end of the day is to make a profit. So I do worry about why we're collating this data and how we're going to interpret it and what measures that will lead to.
Oh, before I let Susan come back to that, Emily, I just want to ask you, as a young woman, research actually suggests that women who have children have been found to earn almost half of their previous salaries in the 6 years after giving birth, known as the motherhood wage penalty. Do you worry about your options and your career prospects after potentially having children?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question. I think childcare is a massive issue for women. It often doesn't make financial sense for women to go back to work full time because childcare costs more than their salary might, which is a ridiculous state of affairs. And there are many reasons for why that are that we won't go into now. But, you know, I think there's also the case that women make different choices to men, and that should be something that feminists celebrate rather than condemn or try to necessarily change. You know, for many women, once they've had children, their priorities in terms of their career do naturally change. They may decide to go into part-time work, have more flexible work. They're less likely to take on the overtime. They're less likely to potentially want to keep climbing that corporate ladder. So I think the problem with this data is that it doesn't reflect that. We know that there isn't a gender pay gap for people in their 20s between men and women. So it is really that motherhood gap. And we can make things easier for women, sure, and we can ask men to step up more when it comes to childcare. But I don't think we should be casting judgments on women's choices.
Yeah, Susan, isn't that the fundamental point here, that women are making choices and women are still childbearers? You know, contrary to popular belief, men cannot get pregnant, as you well know. So, Susan, isn't this just women making choices? And these pay gap statistics are actually not telling us the full picture.
It can be women making choices, but I think sometimes those choices are almost enforced. I mean, I came from a very high level career in my 20s, which was unsustainable when I became a mother. And so I speak from experience of knowing that there was going to be one person in the family who had to stop. Now, for most families these days, it's not possible to exist on a single salary. So there's social pressure to push women back to the workplace, but there isn't the structural help to keep them in there. And actually, going forward, I think this is going to affect men as well as women, that there have been, and I've heard of situations now where the father becomes the primary carer for a child. And they have the same issues that women do about returning to the workplace. They have the same issues about maintaining their career. And because it's a lesser known, it occurs a lot less than women giving up their career, there maybe isn't the same pressure on it. But I think that, you know, there are a lot of women in later life who can bring back experience. And what they tend to be doing is starting up their own company, starting to do different things. And I think that can be a choice, but it can also be something that is that they have no real option on, because there are programs to help women get back into the workplace, but they are not as robust as they could be. I think one thing that lockdown has shown is how flexible working is possible.
Yeah.
And that it is possible to adjust hours. And, you know, all these things are probably good for men and for women. So if we are able to take apart and say, why is it that women have this maternity issue, and also going forward into menopause, there's a lot of health issues relating to that which are not dealt with, and that's a whole other issue, and that is a struggle as well for women in the workplace. But I think looking at more flexible working is good for men and women.
Exactly, yeah, and that's another conversation to have, I think, but we sadly are out of time. That was the political commentator Emily Carver and Susan Smith, co-director for Women Scotland. Thank you very much for their contribution there. Next, we'll be